We need to basically hand developers a grab bag of intuitive tools that give them no excuse not to use these tools as they're developing code, right? Like let me stop and just click on this button, almost like spell check. Like I've never said that before. We need a spell check for code.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Sneak. Sneak's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source, containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit sneak.io/TSD. That's SNYK.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back into The Secure Developer. Nicole, really excited to have you here with us on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Guy. I'm excited to be here.
And Nicole, we all know now that you've sort of written this great book. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Quite a riveting read or listen for me. I sort of listened to it. For those who are not familiar with it, haven't read it yet, tell us a little bit about what the book is about.
Sure. So the book is really about this race to the bottom that we have been in with cybersecurity. And the title came to me in the shower one day and just sort of stuck. But it's a little bit about my own journey in learning about the threat landscape and our vulnerability. And it comes from the point of view of someone who had very little technical expertise and was essentially thrown into the deep end of the pool onto the cybersecurity beat at the New York Times during what would become one of the most consequential decades for cybersecurity, when threats really moved from identity scams, spam, the occasional high-profile DDoS attack to this post-Stuxnet era, and this recognition from every country under the sun that they could use code not just for espionage, but for destruction. And the goal of the book was really to wake up, not the technical community. People in this industry have known for a very, very long time what the stakes were here, but to wake up the non-technical community and to say, hey, this is not really just a technical problem anymore. This is a societal problem. This is a culture problem. This is a leadership problem. This is a policy problem. And this is an awareness problem. And it's time that all of you learn what's been happening and the trade-offs we've been making on cybersecurity in the name of everything else, whether it was cost savings or convenience or even national security. Old thinking of national security, we were sacrificing cybersecurity for. So that's the book. Yeah. That's the long answer.
The book is full of stories that are interesting, although not always, you're not always happy to sort of hear that they've happened, but they're sort of they're riveting. Even as a techie and even as someone in cyber, there's still some newness, not as much as I would like when listening to it. It kind of gets dark at times, right, in terms of all these stories. Did you have a moment where you sort of wondered, you know what, maybe I don't want to really continue exploring here? Or were there crisis moments in that front?
There were a lot of crisis moments. It took me 7 years to do this book. And it's not that it took me 7 years to write 400 pages or whatever it is. There was a lot of writer's block involved. And I think some of that was fear related to the subject matter. I think some of it was imposter's complex, sort of how dare I, this non-technical woman, journalist, tell this story. And I think there was a lot of fear that because I was a non-technical female New York Times mainstream journalist telling this story, I was definitely scared of the Twitter blowback that I knew would inevitably follow. But interestingly, I never thought, I need to stop here because I'm afraid of nation state hackers coming for me, or I am scared of what will happen if I expose these highly classified programs, offensive programs within government. It was really more about how is this going to land with the cybersecurity community. And I think at a certain point, I just had to put them out of my head and remind myself, I'm not writing it for the community that already knows and has known for a long time what's been happening in this space. I'm writing it for my mom. I'm writing it for Senator Klobuchar. I'm writing it for someone who might have some vague notions of what's going on in this space. Maybe they've read my articles every now and then, but they don't really know how we got here. And they don't really know our own government's role in how we got here. And they don't understand that this is not nuclear. This is not a situation where just because you're on the top and you have the top weapons in the space, your adversaries won't get there. It's really a space where there's a low barrier to entry, and the gap between the cyber superpowers and everyone else was closing much quicker than I think anyone in the intelligence community certainly gave them credit for. And so at the end of the day, I did the book. But I'll tell you that actually the publisher, my original publisher, canceled on me about 2 years before the book came out. And I had to go out and resell the book. And everyone turned me down except for one editor at Bloomsbury, Anton Muller, who said, I just want it as is. I don't want to change the title. I don't want to change a single word. I see that this book needs to get out there, and I will do whatever it takes to get you across the finish line. And thank God that that happened. And I even got a note from the old publisher sort of saying, wow, we really screwed up here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good thing for you for persevering here. And I guess it's like J.K. Rowling has some famously got turned down by sort of, some 50, 60, 70 publishers before.
Right. And guess what? My publisher was her publisher, Bloomsbury. The only one who took her up on it is the only one that took me up on it. So
that's some good insight, if there's sort of the repetition over there. And I think, again, I found the book very interesting, but also I feel it actually is, I think, quite relevant to people in the technical community. Sometimes maybe if you're sort of not technical, by the way, technical people get Twitter blowback all the time as well. But I think a lot of the problem of security is that it's invisible. It doesn't have a natural feedback loop. You don't really know that you're not doing it right, that you're sort of causing problems. And like it or not, one of the ways of raising awareness and raising, how much people care to look is to sort of understand the cautionary tales, understand the what ifs. And it's hard when you hear about a hack that happened to corporation, it's not you. There's a lot of it won't happen here. And I feel like part of what the book does is it talks about geopolitical impact of sort of cyber espionage and sort of cyber warfare that you can't really say this doesn't affect me. And so I do think you do need to sort of touch home sometimes. And I think it achieves a lot of that.
Yeah, I think that was definitely my takeaway over the last 10 years. And I think it was one that when I went to the person that I call the godfather of cyber war in the United States, this character, Jim Gosler, who's considered a real hero in the intelligence community, he emphasized this point over and over again. If he didn't think that I was paying attention, he would state it again. He would say, Nicole, I need to repeat this. You can never be fully sure that a system doesn't have vulnerabilities. And it goes back to this famous speech by, I believe it was Ken Thompson, Reflections on Trusting Trust, that he gave in the 60s, where he said, unless you've written the code yourself, you can never be fully confident that it doesn't contain a backdoor. And what Jim Gosler said to me was, think of where we are now. Well, think of where we are now with global supply chains. Not only do you not write the code, you don't make the chips. You're not overseeing the factory. In fact, a lot of these factories are in countries that we would call adversaries, like China, that are some of the most prolific backers of state-sponsored hacking and cyber espionage. And so it's just this huge wake-up call that even the people who are at the top of their game don't trust anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned the reflections on trusting trust. I had a talk at QCon a few years ago titled Developer as a Malware Distribution Vehicle. Not as good as your title, but I was fond of it at the time. Talked about that and Xcode Ghost. And today, the world is full of kind of malicious component examples. So indeed, there's a lot of sort of good reason to kind of bring you on here and share the stories with the audience. But specifically, I think, an area that touches home to some people listening here is the whole world of supply chain security, and indeed software produced by, one entity, maybe consumed by another. We'll talk a little bit about maybe the intricacies and what can we do about this. But maybe let's start with some stories. You've come across quite a few of those over here. Can you sort of share a few examples from the book or not around supply chain security and how it indeed plays into the geopolitical cyber warfare world?
I think the biggest supply chain security moment in recent times was SolarWinds. This attack that I'm sure your audience is familiar with, but just in case they've been hiding in a cave somewhere for the last couple of years, this attack conducted by Russia's SVR intelligence agency's hackers that essentially hijacked the software update from SolarWinds, which was a Texas company that marketed itself as a security company, visibility software, software that essentially lets you see what's on your network. And they hijacked the software update. So everyone who did what you're all told we're all supposed to do is keep our software up to date, patch, etc. When they downloaded the latest SolarWinds software update, they were instead getting a Russian Trojan horse. And we now know that Russia used that access to potentially breach some of our most critical government agencies like the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency charged with keeping us safe in this realm, Department of Energy, even some of the nuclear labs used SolarWinds. What struck me at the time was that once this was disclosed, and by the way, it wasn't disclosed by the NSA, or the top hackers in government who for years had been saying, we have a policy of defend forward, active defense. So long as we're hacking into foreign networks, into the SVR systems, into Russia systems, we'll have this early alert system.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
We'll know, what they're up to.
Overconfidence over there in the
a little overconfident. Right. And this attack really exposed our blind spot because they staged it at servers inside the United States where the NSA can't look. It was only discovered because Mandiant or FireEye discovered that they had been breached, and out of the goodness of their own hearts, disclosed that breach. It didn't touch PII, personally identifiable information, which would have triggered state data breach notification laws. So they raised the red flag, and thank God that they did. And then in rewinding the tape, discovered, okay, this started with the update that we did from SolarWinds, and we're able to flag that for SolarWinds and for everyone else. But otherwise, we might not have ever known about this breach. And they were inside our systems, I believe, for as long as 9 months before anyone knew about it. But the final thing I'll say about SolarWinds is what was stunning to me as a reporter was calling up all of these companies listed and government agencies listed on SolarWinds website as customers and trying to confirm that they had been impacted or were at least in the process of trying to forensically understand whether they had been impacted. And half of them didn't even know that they had been using SolarWinds, let alone that SolarWinds had been really under investing in their own security for a long time, that they were now owned by a private equity firm who'd been cost cutting, was essentially now run by an accountant, and that most of the build code was done in Poland, which is Poland, but also Belarus, not exactly a friendly. So it just shined this huge light on our blind spots in the supply chain, in the code itself, in the NSA's ability to actually look for this stuff, in the overconfidence of our offensive strategy in being all we needed to defend ourselves. And I think since then, we've only had more and more wake-up calls. The Log4Shell issue last December, where we learned that this critical open source protocol, I guess you'd call it, was basically a giant vulnerability. And there too, we only learned about it because an employee at Alibaba defied new national security laws in China to flag it for everyone. And actually, Alibaba paid dearly as a result. I believe the Chinese Communist Party ended up suspending some of their government contracts because a couple of years ago, they put in place this new law saying, if you find a critical vulnerability, a 0-day, you must give the state first notice. You can't go out to the broader market, which is what this Chinese engineer had done. And thank God he did, because as a result, we all learned just how vulnerable these systems are. We're still learning, right? I think Jen Easterly has called it the most critical vulnerability she has seen in her career. So over and over again, this just keeps happening and we can't ignore it any longer.
No, so both are indeed kind of key stories, I guess, the poster children now for sort of supply chain security concerns on it. And I guess maybe a question more from like the media lens on it. Log4Shell was interesting because for a moment it was top news on mainstream media sites, for, I say a moment because I feel like I don't know if it was even a day, it was top news, and it felt maybe there was an appreciation for the seriousness of the moment. They made it, but then pretty instantly, I think definitely by the next day, it was nowhere to be found. It was maybe buried somewhere in the sort of the tech pages of the paper. How do you think about that? Like, do you think there is popular appetite to hear about these things, to hear about these concerns? What needs to happen for something to stay in sort of the consumer awareness, sort of the people's awareness for more than a few moments?
Yeah, I mean, you could extrapolate that generally to so many different things. There are so many news items, shootings, mass shootings, Uvalde, Texas, that I mourn the fact they're not front page news still, even this many weeks or months later. How are we still not talking about this? How have we all just seemingly moved on? It's incredibly frustrating, I think, just as a citizen. Security, cybersecurity, it's even worse because it is a technical topic. It's an intimidating topic for a lot of people. And I will say that the hardest part of my job, actually, the hardest part of my job at the New York Times was Twitter. Being a female journalist on Twitter, working for the New York Times, you are going to have a target on your back. It got really ugly very quickly.
Yeah.
But the second hardest part of my job at the New York Times was the badgering I would have to do to try to get some of these major cybersecurity stories, in my opinion, on the front page, convincing the masthead, listen, I know that this is technical. We have to put this on the front page and we have to follow up tomorrow. And we probably have to do a longer deep dive. And it probably won't be ready for a week or two when everyone has moved on. But this is so important. We need to make sure that this sticks. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes I wasn't. And I do think that it is too bad that we had incidents like Y2K, where there was just this
a lot of noise. Yeah.
A lot of noise, and then nothing really seemed to happen. Now, we learned later that actually some serious things did happen in the periphery, but nothing that really made its way into...
Not at the magnitude of what sort of it was made up to be. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that's a huge balance. That was probably my third hardest challenge in my job is how do you walk this tightrope between, whoa, waving hands, hey, this is really important, look over here, and okay, let's not create panic. And that's actually why I ended up doing the book, was because I would parachute into these situations, whether it was Log4Shell. I was just out of the New York Times when that happened, so I didn't cover it, but Heartbleed, SolarWinds, APT attacks, what the US was doing. I'd parachute into these situations and so much was happening at once and almost simultaneously that you're jumping around. It's hard to hold people's attention. And I realized, wow, I think this really needs someone to step back and hold the reader by the hand, the non-technical readers too, and walk them through the space almost in chronological order and make it entertaining. Technical accuracy is critical, but hold their attention long enough to say, hey, these things are all connected. And there is a through line here. and it's pretty ugly where it's going. And so it's time for all of us to sort of pay attention and connect the dots here. And so that, I would say, my book in the end, I feel like had far greater impact in holding attention spans than any one article I did at the New York Times.
Yeah. Well, and I guess there's people come in and you get a chance to sort of build up a bit of their knowledge, amidst the story included versus the sort of the brief attention span of a story. And I will say that what you're describing here sounds awfully similar to developer security training programs that have been successful. We had teams from Segment, now at Twilio, for instance, talking about how it's important to get real world vulnerabilities that happen in their systems into the training that happens to, that they give to their developers, because otherwise people generally have a hard time engaging, they have a hard time focus and remembering and retaining information. So within the software world, I think it's at this point fairly accepted that the whole notion of a culture of security and having people sort of understand that security matters and care about security, they often push back when we talk about developer securities. People say, well, developers don't care about security, right? And you have to dispel that and get developers engaged. Is that also true from a societal perspective? I mean, can we address the gravity of this concern without getting public appreciation for it? Or is that sort of a necessity to get these stories to stick around or arrive on the sort of front page a bit more often?
Well, just stepping back a bit. So I think we've been on this collision course, certainly while I was at the New York Times and probably before when I was at Forbes, just covering the startup scene in general. We've been on this collision course between what Mark Zuckerberg articulated as move fast and break things and what Mark Andreessen articulated as software eats world. These things that, move fast. It doesn't have to be perfect. Speed is critical. That is the enemy of security. Speed has always been the enemy of security. So what do we do to remind the developer to essentially slow down and fix their shit, which I point out at Facebook now, where there used to be graffiti that said, move fast and break things. The last time I visited, it said, slow down and fix your shit. So there is certainly the awareness has trickled down at Facebook.
What's called written in blood, right? Like sort of
Right, exactly.
based on historical learnings.
Yes. There's a point where I thought about making my gravestone say, slow down and fix your shit. But no, I think the best example of how to hammer this home is what Google now does. When you are a new hire at Google, I believe they still do this. I hope they still do this. Heather Adkins, who's headed up their information security, walks you through the Aurora attack, the 2009 attack by a Chinese APT on Google. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you fit into the organization, whether you're a developer or you work in completely non-technical sales office somewhere, doesn't matter. She'll tell you the story about how someone in their Beijing office at the time was convinced to click on a link, and I believe then it was their America Online Instant Messenger or MSN Instant Messenger in those days, whatever the Slack predecessor was in those days, and how that translated to dissidents' Gmail accounts getting hacked. And I think what's so powerful about that story is that, hey, wake up, it starts with you. You click on one spear phishing link. It doesn't happen anymore because Google, I think, epitomizes zero trust now as an organization. But you click on this one spear phishing link, you could get someone killed. It's not that far of a stretch. And that is our only way out, is that kind of storytelling to everyone in the organization. When I interviewed Bob Lord as he was leaving the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, after the 2020 election, I said, what did you do to keep the DNC from getting a repeat instance of what happened in 2016? And he said, it was really hard. I did not have the budget I had for security at Yahoo or before that at Twitter. We have operatives everywhere. This is like a really hard to defend organization that is an extremely high target, right? You can't deny it's a target.
Mm-hmm.
We all saw what happened with John Podesta's risotto recipe. Something as seemingly innocuous as risotto become weaponized in an election.
Yeah.
So I said, how'd you do it? And he said, I wish I could tell you there was like a magic algorithm, but what it was the organization made it a priority. They told me that I had 5-10 minutes at every single all hands meeting to use however I wish, but basically to hammer home the criticality of information security and cyber hygiene. He put a checklist on the back of the women's bathroom, men's urinal that had a big Bobmoji on it. And it said, have you turned on MFA? Are you using Signal for your most sensitive communications? Have you done the latest software update? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are you using hardware MFA keys? And that's what he credited, was basically putting a Bobmoji above the urinal and saying, like, don't forget, you too. It's almost like the Smokey the Bear equivalent for forest fires. It's just someone reminding you, don't throw your cigarette out the window. You play a very critical role in preventing the next forest fire. And as weird and soft as that sounds, we absolutely need to address the human behavior element to this problem. Why? Because how did Colonial Pipeline get breached? It got breached because one employee whose account they never deactivated had a crappy password. How did Equifax get hacked? They got hacked through, I believe it was a vulnerability in, what was it, Apache?
In Apache Struts, like an open source Java library.
Right. A mistake in the code, right? Is that too simplistic?
No, it's okay. It's a bug, a security bug. Yeah.
Right. So it's user error. We think of this as a technical problem, but at the end of the day, it's really user error. And the only way to address user error is to convince the user to care about this. And the only way I know how to convince people to care about it is either to hack them myself. Everyone always seems to get religion after they get hacked. You only turn on MFA after your Instagram account gets taken over, whatever it is. Or you tell them the story, the really bad story about Colonial Pipeline or Aurora or your friend that got hacked and what happened in the aftermath. That's the only way I know how.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's the constant debate, right, in security, because on one hand, maybe it's like to your example about Y2K, right? If you yell wolf on a regular basis and most of the time, so, well, they keep telling me I need to do this, but look, it's been 5 years I've been doing this and nothing happened. Probably nothing will happen in the sort of the next 5 years is a constant concern, right? And sort of alert fatigue. So I guess the balance is always between constant mindfulness and awareness and desensitization of saying, well, you keep telling me about it, but you're just spreading fear because whatever, it serves your purpose or your sort of agenda, and it's not real. But I guess the more concrete and the more kind of close to home it is, the more people will get into the religion. As you point out, everybody gets religious after they're hacked. Hopefully we find slightly better approaches over time. I'd love to talk a little bit about observations that you have coming into the industry from outside, actually, because you're maybe, not technical and you're looking at it. Sometimes we get blinded to it a bit inside. But before I do that, I just before we leave the stories side a bit, I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about Ukraine. I know you're sort of not at the New York Times at the moment, but still, from what you sort of see, have you seen cyber warfare, or specifically supply chain, play a role? There seems to have been sort of a sense of almost, I don't know if I want to say disappointment, but there was like maybe expectation that there would be more visible blowouts on the space from Russia's force doing it. Any thoughts on what's happening over there? What you've heard?
So in some ways, my book was prescient in that it starts in Ukraine after the 2017 NotPetya attack. And so when the invasion started, I was getting a lot of great questions, very positive, affirming, validating questions like, how did you know to start this in Ukraine? And did you know this would happen? And now the question is, do you think you were wrong that that Ukraine would create all this blowback for cyber? I think it's just more nuanced, as most things are. I think that we are seeing maybe the limits of cyber war tested in real time. That's one thought I have. But I think that the horrors of what is happening on the ground in Mariupol, some of the, to me, just it's cringeworthy to read about some of the atrocities, human atrocities that happened, rapes, forced migration,
Horrible stories. Yeah.
horrible stories. And those obviously are going to consume your bandwidth for attention in ways that code and cyber will never be able to compete unless you see a big explosion or maybe a colonial pipeline. But when you look at the facts on the ground, we now know that actually Russia did infect a couple Ukrainian substations, power stations, in the weeks of the invasion. Now, they didn't turn off the power, but they could have. They could have turned off the power to millions of Ukrainians, but they didn't. And I suspect, and you'd have to be a fly on Putin's wall to know why they didn't shut the power down, right?
Yeah.
But I suspect that if the reporting is accurate, that Russian intelligence believed that Russia would have its puppet government installed in Kyiv in 48 to 72 hours. They wouldn't need to shut the power off. They'd only be sabotaging themselves, right? So they got in, they got the foothold, and then they waited until things weren't necessarily going their way to time the actual detonation, because we know they didn't time impact until April, when it was clear things weren't going Russia's way. And thank God, thanks to really what I would call unprecedented collaboration between allies, government agencies, including CISA, the agency I now advise here in the United States, and the private sector, private security companies on the ground, they discovered and were able to remediate this attack before Russia could turn the lights off. Similarly, Microsoft raised the flag when they discovered wiper malware on critical Ukrainian banks and government agency systems, and were able to help remediate before we saw the worst case scenario. Similarly, we know that Russia, we believe, I don't know if the attribution has been nailed, but hacked Viasat, this satellite internet broadband provider, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe, and basically interrupted people's modem connections. And that could have really swung the information war Russia's way if we hadn't been able to see this incredible footage, not just from news organizations, but from grandmothers' phones, from their rooftops, of sort of these Russian atrocities on the ground. But lo and behold, in came Starlink and Elon Musk. We all probably have some strong feelings about Elon, but in this case, this was a really, I think, underappreciated Elon moment, that he was contacted actually by a Ukrainian CEO here in Silicon Valley who went to college with Zelensky, and was asked if he could do anything, because Zelensky said, hey, we have 5 internet links in and out of the country, and we believe Russia's going to bomb all of them, which they eventually, I believe, did. Can you help? And I think the quote I heard Elon say was something like, oh, you want me to help take out an authoritarian dictator? That's on my bucket list.
That sounds fitting of the stereotype. I don't know him personally, but sounds in character.
So they were able to mitigate the internet going out, the power going out, all of their data being destroyed. But these things were attempted.
Right. They just didn't make the titles, because sadly there were far worse things from like a human interest perspective, and what people are, looking to find out about that were happening in it.
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say about Ukraine is we're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah.
The more we tighten the screws on Russia with sanctions, with the ban on Russian gas, vodka, diamonds, the more we explore this theory of do we ban visas, et cetera, the more likely it is that Putin will respond directly to the West. So far, it's all been a lot of just fear-mongering and threats. But I think the most likely way to respond directly to the West is via cyber, because until now, it really has been declared a short of war weapon. We haven't seen anyone respond sort of in kind to some of these egregious attacks like Colonial Pipeline, or even the Ukrainian power outage that Russia did in 2015, 2016. So I think something will come of this, but I do have to say I've been surprised and actually rather hopeful for the first time that we might be able to hack our way out of this with the kind of declassification that the US government and our allies have been doing together in tandem, with the real-time information sharing that has been happening. And I mean, Slack channels have been lighting up for almost a year now, sharing what people are picking up on their networks. Basically, we're doing all the things that we've talked about being critical and necessary, but never actually made progress on. And so we are not letting a good crisis go to waste. And I hope that shields up, as CISA calls it, just becomes the new normal.
Yeah. And I think I agree with you that it's a demonstration a bit of what could happen if you collaborate, not dissimilar to the sort of the COVID coming together of the scientific community there to say, well, when there is some unity along with caliber, along with sort of capability, you can actually thwart some pretty serious enemies for now, and that the job is not done. But thanks. This is super insightful on it. And yeah, you phrased it well. Don't let a good crisis go to waste, in the sense of understanding what happens if this happens again, and how do we continue, and to an extent, an acceleration of certain trends and drives for transparency and security and things like that you have actually mentioned in the book. And they were sort of long-term trends. So this might have fueled that fire.
Yeah, it's almost like the antidote to what happened during COVID. Like, I was racing to finish my book during COVID, and we were seeing a huge uptick in the frequency of attacks. And it was clear that adversaries, threat actors, cyber criminals were all exploiting remote work, the rush to remote work. It was clear that because this was a global pandemic, that we were leaving it to each nation to figure out how to respond. There was a lot of APT activity, some from countries that had never really crossed our desks, that were hacking each other just to figure out what everyone else was up to, or how far along they were with vaccine development, or what China knew when they knew it when. So what I said in my book was something, it's been a while now, something like, this is either going to be a learning lesson and we're going to adjust our defenses accordingly, or this is just a very, very small glimpse of the nightmare that will come. And I think Ukraine, interestingly, is sort of the more hopeful prism. It's sort of like, here's a glimpse at what cyber defense and collaboration and threat sharing and declassification and partnering with our allies and having a unified response could look like in cyber. Here's the impact it could have. And we can't just let this trickle out. We have to figure out how to keep it up and keep improving, keep iterating, and keep sharing.
Yeah. And you actually mentioned to me in a conversation before this around actually seeing a bit of a dip in ransomware payouts during basically potentially affiliated with the Ukraine war.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think this data is still being collected, but Nozomi, which specializes in industrial control security, where I'm now an advisor, shared with me that one of the things they're seeing is, instead of ransomware, they're saying just wiper malware. So that's one data point. The other is what Reported Future and others who really are tracking ransomware have said, is that there has been this sort of mysterious dip in ransomware attacks on the United States. And I know also TRM Labs, which tracks blockchain intelligence and tracks ransomware payments, is seeing a big reset among some of the major Eastern European, let's say, ransomware groups, that they're sort of rejiggering. And one theory here is that for a long time, we know ransomware victims were just paying, right? The ransomware groups knew just what to charge. It was always going to be cheaper than the cost of total remediation and the threat that your data was going to pop up online. So victims were paying for a long time. After the Russian invasion, general counsels had to say, hey, I don't know if we can pay this. I don't know where this ransomware group is based, but if there is an even minuscule chance that they are based in Russia, we would be in violation of sanctions by paying them right now. We can't pay. So we started seeing some resistance pop up that I don't think ransomware groups expected or anticipated, or for a long
Definitely
time.
is a bit more roundabout kind of implication.
Right. And we also started seeing a pickup in ransomware against other countries in Latin America, for example. But there is an interesting question to be asked, which is, maybe actually this idea we should ban ransomware payments and just have a blanket policy has some legs as a deterrent. And then, like I said, Nozomi said, in some cases, there is no ransom. They're just wiping. So maybe these groups that would have charged you a ransom are just sort of giving you the middle finger.
And just sort of looking to attack and cause damage.
Right.
Super, super interesting. So we kind of veered, I think, a little bit that although it's still all kind of impacts of vulnerabilities and activities, let's sort of maybe spend the last stretch talking about what we can do about them. And so we talked about this a little bit. We talked about awareness and coming in. You mentioned the value of training and raising awareness inside the organization. When you think maybe like on two fronts, on one side from an industry or society, and on the other side, maybe more so from a DevSecOps development side, what do you think, or what do you heard suggestions on that we should be doing, that we can do to change a bunch of these equations? Supply chain security is massive, maybe at the scale of like fake news in terms of its complexity. What can we do about this?
So the first thing I'll say is we need our Steve Jobs of cybersecurity. We need someone to come in who makes this a lot easier to be secure than it currently is, right? I'm out there talking all day long about how it's inexcusable if you don't have MFA turned on your email, on your financial accounts, on your social media accounts, right? But then I have friends that I went to Princeton with who are like, I've been trying for 3 days now to turn MFA on my Venmo account, and I'm sorry, I can't figure it out. I give up. That's ridiculous. If it's hard for my Ivy League educated friend who peripherally works in cybersecurity to turn MFA on her Venmo account, then we are failing everyone as an industry. That's just ridiculous. So I think we need a Steve Jobs of cybersecurity to make security as intuitive as the iPhone was when it was released. It should be just as simple to turn on MFA as it is to download an app on your iPhone. And right now it's a nightmare. And the stakes only get higher the longer you wait, right? So that's number one, is we need to attack this problem from a usability and design perspective. And I'm still waiting for that. I think at the DevSecOps layer, we need to basically hand developers a grab bag of intuitive tools that give them no excuse not to use these tools as they're developing code, right? Like just, let me stop and just click on this button, almost like spell check. Like we need it. Actually, I've never said that before. We need a spell check for code. So there's a huge market opportunity there. The other thing we need is we need quantifiable risk metrics. We need to know how much risk I'm taking on when I hire you, or I bring in your software, or I acquire you. And there's nothing like it. There's no FICO score for cybersecurity. Now, there are companies like BitSight who are looking at this problem. And they are doing it from the outside, right? They're looking for anything they can from the outside, scanning your network, seeing if you have some server out there on the web that doesn't have MFA turned on, or that they could potentially access as a hacker, that kind of thing. That is a really good start. And we need to standardize that, right? But at some point, we need to figure out a new incentive model, hopefully not a regulation model, that incentivizes boards to want to know how risky they are, to want to know how much risk they are bringing to their customers and business partners when they work with them or when they finally merge systems. And there's just nothing like it. We have these sort of one-off piecemeal, oh, maybe in this contract, we require you to get a pen test. Like, it's not enough. And again, it's ridiculous. I mean, to do a basic bathroom remodel, right, at my house this year, I had to wait several months, have an inspector come over, and I was forced to move the toilet 2 inches, and he wouldn't certify our remodel plans until we agreed to move our toilet 2 inches because it created some risk for plumbing, right? Like, it's annoying. Okay. I hope we don't get to that level of regulation. But it's ridiculous that that's the level of effort I have to go to put some tile on my bathroom floor and do a new shower. But there's no equivalent when Verizon acquires Yahoo or a company agrees to work with SolarWinds and give them blanket access essentially to their network. I mean, that is stupidity. It's just insanity. So we need standards. I really am pushing hard on this idea that, listen, as a capitalist society, we have to work with incentives. We have to figure out how to work with incentives because, unfortunately, when you do regulations in the United States, number one, we have a terrible track record at creating comprehensive, nuanced cybersecurity legislation.
Yeah.
All you do is look
It's
at
hard. It's a complicated and fast-moving space. It's hard for legislation to kind of keep up to some of it.
Exactly. But why can't we create tax breaks for companies that agree to get a real pen test, not a compliance guy come in with a checklist, but a real pen test, and then show, okay, you don't need perfect security, but show, okay, over time between, this time, this quarter and 2 quarters ago, I was able to minimize my attack surface by 30%. Great. You should get a tax break because your cybersecurity posture is, especially if you're a water treatment plant or a SolarWinds or whatever you are, there's so many companies that really are critical infrastructure, United States critical infrastructure, global critical infrastructure. So we should be figuring out how to help secure them. And we haven't figured that out yet on the regulation front. So I'm hoping we can figure it out as a form of incentive structures.
Yeah. So it's, first of all, just kind of get back a little bit to the squiggly line, because I'd be remiss to say 100% the line. And in fact, to an extent, what we're sort of doing at Snyk, literally, we have a little squiggly line behind the code. Still a long way to go, and there's a lot.
I love that. Like you're writing the code and it's sort of like, are you just
literally? Yeah, technically, I think it's as you hit save, but the autosave works as well. The thing will show you if you've sort of written a security mistake in the library or in your code.
I mean, I think some of the biggest advancements in cybersecurity are not the ones that the cybersecurity community generally thinks about. I think it's things like biometric facial recognition on your iPhone. I think it's things like when you're typing in a new password and it tells you it's weak, medium, or strong. Right. It's these basic things that trigger that cortisol response where it's like, oh, I don't want a crappy password. I want an A+.
Yeah, to do the, and we had Adrian Ludwig on the podcast a while back, and he's a CISO at Atlassian, and he was commenting and says, like, I don't want enterprise security. I want consumer security. Like, I want my developers to get consumer grade security, because in consumers, you don't expect people to have a degree in how to sort of write secure code. You expect the security control to be easy enough that anybody, that your mom can handle. So I kind of feel bad for moms, like they've become the the poster child of maybe it's grandma, maybe today it's also that your grandma can operate.
Definitely grandmother.
But I think
moms have enough on their plate. But that's kind of like it's an interesting point because think of like the busiest person it's probably a working mother or even just a stay-at-home mother or father, and they have so much on their plate. When I see them at school drop-off, they're like, cybersecurity, like, how do you live with yourself?
Not exactly.
And it's like, well, you're the person that we should be helping.
With the new executive order from Biden, a decent amount of that is about transparency, right? You can argue useful or not, but for instance, it requires the software bill of materials to sort of pass on from vendor to the customer alongside a whole bunch of other requirements. How do you see that sort of playing into the mix here? Do you think it moves the needle? What's your perception here?
I just am so happy to have seen the word software bill of materials in an executive order. I was jumping up and down. I mean, listen, like I now serve on this CISA advisory committee. So some people will think this is a bias or a political bias, but I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have joined them if I didn't think that this administration was serious about cybersecurity. And that Biden cyber executive order is the most comprehensive piece of cybersecurity policy, anything we have seen in this country. And frankly, I think it's a brilliant document because software bill of materials, I'm just putting aside for a second, I apologize. But to me, the magic in it was this recognition that the government has limited purview or authority when it comes to our cyber hygiene. And it recognizes that that is a terrible place to be when 85% of our critical infrastructure is in private sector hands, right? It's completely backwards. So what the document did was it said, okay, we can't regulate this, right? We're going to be accused of being regulation hungry Democrats if we try and go crazy on this. But what they did was they said, okay, here are the NIST standards. We will let you self-certify that you meet these NIST standards, okay? You don't even have to go to a third-party auditor. We're not going to make you do the thing I had to do when I did my bathroom remodel by moving the toilet 2 inches. You can self-certify that you meet these NIST standards. But if we catch you lying to us and you are a federal contractor, you are banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. That is the first stick I have ever seen really in this space. And it has had a huge impact. So good on them for figuring out how to use essentially the power of the purse to say, hey, cut it out. Can't accuse us of adding regulation here because we're letting you self-certify, but you better meet these requirements if you want to do business with the biggest buyer out there, which is us. So hats off to them for that. I've been pleased. I note this in the book. Medical devices. There's been a lot of progress on medical devices on SBOM, on the software bill of materials. And I think that is where we have to go. We should know what open source code is baked into these systems that are so critical, like a pacemaker, and what software is in there. And then ideally, back to my previous point about quantifiable risk metrics, what's the sort of risk score of that software? I think that is a nutrition chart, basically, for cybersecurity, I think is brilliant. And it's amazing we don't have it already. And it's going to be an ugly process to get there, but we absolutely need it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. And it aligns well if I sort of recap a little bit. A lot of this does come back to the right incentive models and the right visibility, a bit more interesting concept. I haven't heard of it, sort of the tax credit, I think aligns. We're talking about it can't be all stick. There needs to be some carrot for sort of doing the right thing. So that carrot on one hand might be the tax incentive, but also it would be the ability to sell. I don't know, you can debate whether that's a stick or a carrot. It's a pretty big stick that you can sell there. But in general, be more successful by touting your security certifications, security investments to sell more, but also raise and simplify that awareness everywhere and increase the transparency with the hope that it mobilizes us to act. And I think just to sort of say that Tim from Ambient here, and I'm sort of name dropping a bunch of past guests, but Tim from Ambient and Jeff from LinkedIn, the CISOs there both commented on how they kind of expect public markets to also introduce things that are along the lines of the generally acceptable accounting principles that happened post Enron and sort of the fraud were there when it comes to security.
I call that the digital Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's coming. It is coming. And my hope is that all of the people involved in that legislation will have read my book and have had at least a basic primer in the issues involved before they send out that legislation, because it could go terribly wrong or it could be exactly what we needed. But yeah, I think we had almost too much hope, for instance, that cyber insurance would save us. And it didn't, right? Yeah. It ended up being an enabler for ransomware because in too many cases, insurance companies were saying, oh, just pay the ransom. That's going to be a lot cheaper than the other option. So sometimes market solutions are not perfect, and neither is regulation. So yeah, I mean, like I said, when I said among my target audience was Senator Klobuchar, it's like, yeah, someone who is interested in this issue, who could potentially be a leader on this issue and has the capacity for nuanced policy thinking is perfect. So yeah, let's hope
some improvement. There's definitely raised awareness in it. And, we continue to do our share and sort of see where it leads us. Nicole, huge thanks for coming onto the show. I encourage anybody to find, I assume your book is basically, you can find it on any one of the platforms that you might expect. And really kind of a good read for awareness, and for what it's worth, also like an interesting, fun read and great storytelling. So recommend it. But thanks for coming on and sharing more insights over here.
Thank you, Guy. I really have loved speaking with you. And, I'm always intimidated when I speak to someone at your technical caliber. But when you start having these discussions, you realize there's just so much overlap and alignment in our thinking. And we come at this from such different perspectives. And this is one way out too, having these conversations with people who are coming at the same problem from completely different areas. So I really appreciate you doing this, and thanks for having me.
No. And I think I mentioned this to you as well, which, I believe that you kind of need to leave security to fix security. Like, when you're in an echo chamber, when you look around, it's hard to see how things might evolve or change. And so it's great to get your fresh perspective. And I think there's been much more alignment than misalignment in the views from inside. So thanks you, and thank everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.